Welcome into the Psych with Mike Library. This is Dr. Michael Mahan, and I am here with my good friend and colleague, Mr. Brett Newcomb.
Good morning. Well, good to be back.
Yeah, good to be back. This is take two. I messed up. We had recorded this episode actually once, and I somehow ended up with a corrupted file. So we're gonna do this over.
Yeah. If only you knew about technology.
If only.
Yeah.
Although I will say this is the first time that I've ever messed up the file. So
oh, okay.
Yeah. So
the file.
Yeah. Yes, the file. But when we started this last time, you talked a little bit about students that we have taught and our desire to possibly get reconnected with some of them if anybody would like to contribute to the show. And so why don't you go ahead and...
Well, what I had said was both of us have taught at a university level for more than 30 years for people that wanted to be counselors to teach how we thought it should be done. And we talk about topics that are relevant to doing a good job as a therapist or a counselor. And if some of those students out there manage to find their way forward and earn a living doing this stuff, and they have opinions of their own that they'd like to share or at least participate in a discussion with us about these things, please get in touch with us. We'd love to hear from them.
Yeah, and you laughed, but you feel actually quite strongly about that.
I do, actually, because in part, I mean, a lot of the students I thought were pretty smart and got close to them and felt like they would be successful, and I'd like to hear from them that they are.
Yeah.
And why they are.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Yeah. It's always good to, it's really actually very affirming to find out that somebody that you taught actually took that information and became successful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was the goal.
Yeah. And you know that that's true.
Yeah.
I'm successful.
I know that not only about you, but a number of other people.
Right.
Yeah.
And I know that there are numbers of individuals that I taught as well that have gone out and been very successful. And truly and honestly, it is humbling and affirming to have that knowledge. It is amazing to me that I could play a role in that. It is really humbling to think that that has been my life course.
It's humbling and it's gratifying. If you are a teacher and you teach people things that you value, then it's always gratifying to hear back from them. I taught high school for 20 years, 30, 40 years ago.
Right.
And I still hear from students that I had in high school that have very kind things to say about the impact that I had, and it makes me feel really good. Also, I've stayed in touch with a number of people that I taught at the university level, like you, but they're not just the ones I'm talking to today.
Right.
I'm talking to all
You're
of them.
talking
We've
about
had thousands of students.
Anybody
Yeah.
that might be listening to this that
Yeah.
ever had a connection to either one of us.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I actually would like to echo that. I hope that somebody does hear this and again gets contact with us. If you would like to get in contact with us, you can reach me at michaelmahan72@yahoo.com, or you can go on the Psych with Mike website, psychwithmike.com, and connect with us there. So neither one of us, I don't think, are particularly difficult to find if somebody wants to get a hold of us. And so if that is the case, please do reach out and contact us, and we will facilitate that process. So today we wanted to revisit this idea of substance abuse, which is something that is very near and dear to me. I actually have a reputation, good or bad, for being a substance abuse counselor. The way that started was that I got into behavioral health through the recovery process. I was in school in the early days in the 1980s when substance abuse was huge and was at its peak. And because I was in school, started working in behavioral health, then went through my own process of recovery. And subsequently, when you reached out to me after I had graduated and said, hey, I want you to go talk to somebody and get into private practice, I think that's where you need to go. I was a counselor in a substance abuse program and had been working there for 20 years and didn't feel like that I could make that shift because of the investment that I had there, but I took that chance and went out and met with Mary Fitzgibbons, who at that time and still is the director of West County Psychological Associates. And when I came into the fold there, the niche that I was put into, because she was actually looking for somebody to head up a very specific division, a substance abuse division of her practice, that was kind of where I got thrown. And, you know, I certainly believe that I have an expertise in that, but I've always felt like people shouldn't try and constrict themselves. I'm always trepidatious about people who say, I want to do this. I want to be a marriage and family counselor, or I want to do adolescents, or I want to do kids, because I think that, you know, we train people to be therapists, and I believe that you can, if you are trained well, be a therapist for human beings. But I certainly also understand the need for a niche.
I think there are many rooms in my father's mansion. I like to wander through as many of them as I can get through.
Agreed.
But the premise that you make is an accurate one for me. I think that you can be a good therapist relevant to any topic of discussion. You have to have confidence in the process of therapy, and you have to have a knowledge base, which is what we talked about before. You have the knowledge base, not to recite facts and figures and statistics and reference articles to your patients, but you need to know what you're talking about. And the way that I've seen the field go in the last number of years is towards more and more specialization. And I don't see that as, although the claims are made that it is in service of protecting the consumer, I see it more as a device or an artifice for limiting trade, so that if you don't have the right credential from the right source or the right license, then you can't do the work. You know, so if you don't have a credential license for working with children, then you shouldn't work with children. If you don't have one for substance abuse, you shouldn't work with substance abuse. If you don't have one for traumatic brain injury, then you shouldn't work with somebody that has a traumatic brain injury. And I like to think that we're working with people, and that a lot of the issues that are presenting problems are not the real problems. And especially when it comes to substance abuse, I'm different because I'm less directive. And those who are in the substance abuse field tend to be very directive. You will go to 12 AA meetings in the next 20 minutes, and you will do this and eat this food and not drink that substance and whatever, and that'll make you better. I don't agree with that approach.
Right.
So,
and, you know, I think that sometimes when I talk to people who either are professionally in the field or are in recovery, you know, and I say to them, you know, I don't think you need to be recovering to work with recovering people. Sometimes people are startled by that because they want to believe that, or they have been taught to believe that, because especially in substance abuse, very particularly, the belief has been that you have to go through it to be able to help other people who are going through it.
if you've never been raped, you can't be a rape counselor.
Right.
If you've never been divorced, you can't be a divorce counselor.
Right.
You know, I don't agree with that.
I don't agree with that either.
But when you came into the field in the 80s, when it was a big surge in the St. Louis area at any rate, the agencies that were hiring staff just to do substance abuse treatment almost had an equal balance between people with an education in counseling or psychology or whatever the field was, social work, and people that were recovery individuals, whether they had an education or not. I mean, high school diploma or not. If you had been a person in recovery, you were qualified to be employed and help other people reach recovery. And now that doesn't seem to be the approach, but for a while it was.
Not only was it a balance, and maybe even in the facility where I worked, it may have even been tipped in favor of those individuals who were recovering, but those individuals who were recovering were oftentimes looked on and heralded as even superior to individuals who had an education. And I think that that was a mistake. I knew a lot of people who were recovering and a lot of people who had educations, and I think the people who had educations were more consistently good therapists.
Well, and I would argue that even if you're skilled enough in manipulating the circumstances so that you can convince somebody to stop using their drug of choice or their addicted focus, what happens is they develop replacement addictions. So if I give up drinking and I get addicted to work, or I get addicted to smoking, or I get addicted to something else, because they haven't dealt with the underlying drive of the addiction, to fill the hole that exists in somebody's soul that they're trying to fill with a substance.
And that is a great segue into my belief, which is probably very different and maybe one that nobody who's listening to this podcast has ever heard before. I very firmly believe that substance abuse at its core is really an attachment disorder.
Yeah, there's a lot of literature that says that.
Yeah.
More recent.
Well,
literature.
and I think that it is. There is beginning to be some deference paid to that, and certainly some of the information that I'll be including in the show notes supports this. But for a lot of people, I think that the philosophy has always been, well, you have a primary substance use disorder, and therefore you have bad relationships. And I've always seen it as the other way around. That you have a deficit in your capacity for attachment, which is probably has its etiology, its origin in very young childhood, and that actually lays the foundation for later substance abuse.
I would agree. Not just substance use. I mean, so many disorders in our adult lives
Right.
can be traced back to things that happened as a child. Then you get to the question of, so what? I mean, I'm an adult of a substantial number of years. If I'm still struggling with something that happened in my childhood, then is it worth going into therapy to go back and talk about, my mother abandoned me when I was 3 years old? Or is it better to approach saying, well, I'm an adult now and I have my own money, my own house, my own relationships. Why can't I make them work right? What do I need in my life that I don't have? Because my mom's dead. I can't go back and reparent with her in a dialogue.
With her, yes.
So, my focus on therapy at that point would be, how do you reparent yourself so that whatever scripts were distorted get undistorted, but not spend a whole lot of time going back and saying, let's talk about the time you fell out of the crib when you were 3 years old. To me, that it may require some exploration, but it isn't ever going to be the focus of therapy that I'm going to do.
So I want to talk more about what we talk about when we say reparenting, what that means.
Yeah.
But my feeling, so I want to see if you agree with this, is not just reparent yourself, but reparent with the therapist.
Yeah, you have to have some guidance for what good reparenting is.
Because
then
for
you
us,
have to do the work. I mean,
right.
I don't do the work, but I try to provide you with the framework.
Well, but do you think, so if we define reparenting, the way that I would define that is that we go back to my Cohuttian philosophy, self-psychology, which is mirroring idealization and twinship. So you have to have a good model. You have to idealize that external object, and then you have to want to merge with that external object to bring it in and make it a part of who you are. And so the therapist provides the ego structure for that model, because I think that if you say to a person, okay, you have to go and you have to create that model for yourself, that might be too much.
Yeah, if they haven't seen it, how are they going to do that?
Exactly.
If they don't know what that looks like.
So that's what I mean by the therapist becomes the model, and so is an integral part of that reparenting process.
Yes, I would agree.
Yeah. And so then for specifically substance abuse, my feeling is that we have, for people who are primarily substance dependent, so have more than just a situational substance abuse, right? So, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think as a therapist, I would say you have choices to make that you can make, you have the power to make. But that begins and can work in therapy, and the role that the therapist provides is primarily that safe holding environment where the acceptance, the uncritical, unjudgmental acceptance of the narcissistic grandiosity of the person, the infant child, in the same way that a parent accepts their infant child's narcissism, and then allow them to experience that message of acceptance and understanding and affection, respect.
As non-judgmental.
And when they make mistakes, explore, okay, what's the nature of the mistake that you may have made? Why do you feel that it's a mistake? What other options do you have? Could you do something different? Do you want to try something different? So that you can see if that is better for you. That's not me telling you what you have to do.
Right.
Get a divorce, quit drinking. That's me saying, okay, you need to figure out, and I'm going to sit here and listen to you process it, and I'm going to help you hear what you're saying until you see what you need to see.
Right.
Whatever that may be for you.
Right.
I don't have that answer for you, but you have it.
Right. And so then, yeah, that term
Yeah.
then that I would use is mirroring.
Right.
And if you say safe holding environment, so, the safe holding environment is more of a humanistic kind of Carl Rogers verbiage. Maybe even from your perspective, that might be a Yalom kind of existential perspective. I think it applies. Both of those things apply.
Yeah.
And
I don't care what you call it.
exactly,
You
and
have
that's
to do
what
it.
I was going to say. Is that to me, it doesn't matter what you call it.
Right.
But that is correct. That the most essential thing in therapy, I tell people this all the time. If you are in a relationship with a therapist in which you feel emotionally comfortable and not judged, that's going to be a positive experience no matter what else happens.
I think you have to do that to be a good therapist. I mean, and if you can't do that, then you have to figure out what's my problem. Why am I so? Because we talk about countertransference, which is the stuff, my baggage from my life that I bring into the session that I need to try to leave outside as best I can, so that I can listen to your stuff. If I can't get out of my own way, then I can't help you. If my goal is to help you, then I need to get out of my own way.
Yeah.
I need to figure out what that requires.
Right. So I think that there are two different kinds of individuals who may be using or abusing substances. I think there are individuals who get into that situationally, like they have a really bad stretch at work, and they come home and start drinking to unwind, and then that becomes problematic, and I would call that a situational abuse issue. But then there are people who, and I think I fall into this category, who have difficulty from their childhood that revolves around their capacity to be attached to people for whatever reason, and then substance abuse becomes that primary attachment, either filler or the primary attachment mechanism that they utilize, and then that to me is very different and is much more profound and much more ingrained in the individual's psyche and personality.
Yeah, but you still have to. I mean, I agree with you, but you have to spend the time with the individual so that they can figure that out. You can guide them and offer them an opportunity to look at it, but you can't force feed it to them.
Absolutely not.
And you can't preach it to them. If you're preaching, then you're over the line.
And to me, it doesn't even matter whether or not the individual even knows the difference.
Right.
I think as a therapist, I try and gauge whether or not which of those processes I think is happening.
Yeah.
But I don't think that the individual needs to know, because for the individual, what it still comes down to is a choice between, do I just want to learn coping strategies to make my life right now today better, or do I want to go delve into the deep intrapsychic issues about why I got to be this way in the first place?
Well, it's an intellectual trip for the therapist to figure all that stuff out. I mean, that's your own ego getting involved, or mine saying, well, I know what's going on here. Milton Erickson said the therapist doesn't need to know because the client knows. They know where the hole is in their life. They know where the problem is coming from. If they can stand still, catch their breath, and look at it, and they'll know what they need to do to be better. And your job is to help them stand still, look at themselves, evaluate whatever it is that's wrong, and evaluate options and choices that might make it better, and then encourage them to figure out which one of those they want to try.
And I would even agree with you that is an ego need for, not in a bad way, but an ego need for the therapist if they have to do that. I feel like I have to do that. I know that you don't feel as that is as necessary. And
well,
yet,
I don't anymore.
I know, but
35 years ago, my ego was much more present than it is now, I think.
But even though we approach things from very different perspectives in that way,
Yeah.
a lot of times we end up almost always at the same place.
Clinically?
Yeah. So again, I don't care what the individual who's doing therapy needs to call it or needs to think that they need to know about it. In the end, I do say to people, there are two ways that we can go about making you better. Either number one, we can just, figure out better coping strategies. So if you're using substances, we can talk about not using substances, finding other alternative behaviors to be able to get that need met and get you to a place where that isn't causing as many social consequences.
Rome wasn't built in a day. Let's do some triage. If you're arterial bleeding, let's cut that off. If you're losing your job or your marriage because you're drinking, let's work on stabilizing the drinking, save your job and your marriage if that's your goal, and then let's figure out how'd you get here and how can you go forward without doing the same thing or some substance thing that would be just as damaging.
Or we can figure out what are the underlying constituents for why you got to be this way in the first place. And I think that the push right now in psychology is on trauma-based or perspective therapy, that everything comes from a trauma, which I believe is probably true. But then if you're going to approach therapy from that position, then it seems to me that the answer is you always have to find the trauma.
Well,
and sometimes I don't think that's necessary.
Imagine how many conversations you've had over the years with women who were married to alcoholics who divorced them eventually because they got tired of the abuse or the lack of support or the lack of affection or whatever it was. And then they found and married another alcoholic, and they were the most surprised person in the room.
Right.
And you say to them, it's because you are searching for that specific thing. And unless you stop searching for that, you're going to keep finding it.
Right.
So they reject that out of hand the first 1,000 times they hear it. You don't know what you're talking about. How can you say that to me? He wasn't an alcoholic. I said, then you made him be one. Because that's what you needed, Because that's what you needed.
Right.
And they don't want to hear that because it's painful. And to consider then that perhaps their radar needs to be recalibrated so that they are attracted to somebody different that presents themselves differently, that respects them, that's affectionate to them, that isn't trying to manipulate them or control them, whatever it might be. Or that isn't broken so that they can fix them. Maybe they have the need to be Nancy Nurse and take care of this person. Whatever it is, they need to figure out. Not me telling them, oh, hey, I know what's going on here. You need to go date Joe Schmo. Because I don't know. But they know if they stop, catch their breath, pay attention, and experiment with making different choices.
So for me, in the most basic nutshell of all of this is that people who genuinely feel loved and feel like they can love other people tend to have fewer psychological problems.
And who feel lovable.
Yeah, lovable. Yes, absolutely.
I have to feel like I have value, because why would someone want to love me if I don't have any value? I mean, and that for me was a huge struggle to get to that place, and I still struggle with it. And my wife gives me grief about it all the time because I resist hearing that message that I'm worth being loved by somebody. So
yeah,
and that's a challenge.
And that, I say it all the time, that could be a whole show just by itself, right?
Yeah.
Well, that was a really great conversation. So it was actually much different than the first one that we had recorded, but maybe
if only they could have heard that one.
Even better. Well,
but somebody screwed it up, didn't they?
Yeah, I heard that.
Oh.
So if you listen to us as a podcast, please continue to do that. If you catch us on the YouTube, please like and subscribe. There is always a little Psych with Mike icon in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. You click that and you can subscribe to the show. Give us feedback. If you are a former student, please get in contact with us and let us know how you're doing. And if you would like to come on the show and be a part of it, we would love to have that. Also, all of the music that appears in Psych with Mike is written and performed by Mr. Benjamin DeClue, and if it's Friday, it's Psych with Mike.